used to believe my life could be graphed. Clean lines in a spreadsheet, columns aligned like fence posts on a quiet suburban street. Thursday nights were Thai leftovers and a crime podcast. My husband on the couch with the laptop balanced on his knees, our daughter texting from her apartment near campus, and the rain flattening the Oregon evening into a gray wash. It wasn't a bad life, it was a tidy one. On the last Thursday, before everything caved in, Graham kissed my forehead, said he was catching a red-eye to Denver for a supplier audit, and asked if I'd water the rosemary on the back porch. He smiled without showing his teeth. He'd been doing that lately, though I couldn't say when it started. The next morning, the Oregon State Police called to say they'd found my husband's car abandoned near Astoria, 60 miles in the opposite direction of the Portland airport and a 3-hour flight from Denver. "Is this a mistake?" I asked. The dispatcher read the license plate twice, then told me the registration wasn't under the name Ford at all. It was registered to a Grant Fuller. When she asked if that was a known alias or a family name, I didn't know whether to laugh or hang up. I said my husband didn't have aliases, but the word came out weak, as if I wasn't quite sure. I drove to the impound lot with coffee I forgot to drink and a jacket I didn't need. The attendant handed me a clipboard and led me through rows of dented sedans and unlucky pickup trucks to a silver Camry I knew down to the scratch on the bumper where Nora had misjudged the garage last winter. The car smelled like wet wool and sugar. On the passenger seat was a paper bag with 2 cinnamon donuts, both untouched. In the glove compartment, registration to Grant Fuller at a mailbox rental on Killingsworth, and a folded map of the Oregon coast with a red circle over a town I'd never heard of, something with Gull in it, Gull's Reach or Gull's Way. I slipped the map into my jacket because the act of slipping it felt like action, and I needed anything that felt like action. When I got home, the house had an echo, as if sound itself had learned to keep a distance. On the kitchen counter, his mug ringed the quartz like a small eclipse. I opened his office drawers the way I might open someone else's, careful, guilty, looking for something to stop the fall. There was a coffee can in the back of the bottom drawer, filled with screws, rubber bands, and a flash drive the color of a bruise. My hand shook so badly I had to set it on the desk and then sit down. Our cat hopped up on the printer and did that slow, unaware blink, and I thought, I am not equipped for a life where the cat is calmer than the human. It's funny what your brain decides is a sign. The flash drive felt like a sign. The cinnamon donuts felt like a sign. The name on the registration felt like a trap door under the kitchen mat. The doorbell rang at noon. 2 chimes in a row, polite and official. 2 agents introduced themselves as Special Agent Lila Moreno and Special Agent Pruitt from the FBI, and they knew my full name, my maiden name, my workplace, and where Nora's apartment was, which made me nauseous. Moreno had kind eyes and a notepad that matched nothing about her clothes. She asked if she could come in. She asked if we could talk. She asked if Grant Fuller was my husband. "My husband's name is Graham," I said, and the way she looked at me told me she didn't think those were mutually exclusive statements. They didn't want water. They didn't want coffee. They wanted to know when I'd last seen him, where he was flying, what he was auditing, whether he'd seemed anxious, whether he'd changed his routines, whether I'd noticed new friends or habits or purchases. "He bought a different brand of toothpaste," I said before I could stop myself. "It made the sink foam like a science experiment." Moreno's face did a small twitch that could have been sympathy. Pruitt didn't twitch at all. "They asked if they could take his desktop. They asked if they could take the Wi-Fi router. They asked if they could look at his office." I wanted to say no. I wanted to stall. The flash drive sat under a notebook like a heart under a rib.
I said I needed to call my daughter first, and they stepped onto the porch to give me privacy, and I slid the flash drive into my pants pocket. Because I recognized this moment, the one where your life thins to two choices, and you take the one you can live with. Nora didn't pick up. Her voicemail still had the greeting from high school when she recorded it in a British accent. I told her to call me as soon as she could and to stay with a friend and not to answer any unknown numbers. I didn't say FBI. I didn't say her father's car had turned into someone else's car. When I hung up, I looked out at Agents Marino and Pruitt and thought how authority is a costume that fits almost anyone in a black jacket. A minute later, I let them back in and watched them lift cords and label evidence with careful loops of tape. "Do you know the name Atlas North Dynamics?" Marino asked. "I know Atlas North makes drones and ships them to countries we argue about over the dinner table," I said. "Graham does aerospace supply chains for Aeronova. Atlas North's a competitor." "Did your husband ever mention Polar Apex Consulting?" she asked and wrote as she spoke. I didn't answer because I was trying to remember whether Graham had ever mentioned any consulting beyond helping a friend's son with a resume. My mind snagged on the word polar. The map of the coast bore a red circle like a cold sore. The flash drive in my pocket felt as heavy as a child's stone. When they left a business card. Moreno wrote her direct line and the words, "Call me, no matter what." Her handwriting was blocky, honest. I locked the door and leaned my forehead against it and closed my eyes. When the quiet started to thrum, I took the flash drive upstairs to my laptop in the guest room because it wasn't on the search list and because precaution left its shadow wherever the agents had walked. The flash drive asked for a password. I tried our wedding date and our daughter's birthday and the name of the cat. I tried the name of the town I couldn't remember. I tried a blank. The flash drive didn't care. I remember that my neighbor, Rhea Chandler, had once been a reporter before she turned to real estate and yoga, and that she still used words like burner and bootstrap with a familiarity that made other suburban women blush. I sent her a text that read, "I need to ask you a question about a flash drive," and a second later she answered, "I have coffee and plausible deniability." Rhea's kitchen always smelled like toasted almonds and something citrus she probably spritzed into the air. She looked at me the way she looked at houses she could sell, direct, appraising, unstressed. I told her everything I could, tell in sentences that didn't crack. She didn't interrupt. When I said the name Grant Fuller, she walked to her pantry and took down a shoebox labeled taxes and pencil, but containing anything but. She flipped it open to reveal a stack of business cards, receipts, old press badges, FOIA request templates, a locksmith flyer, and a portable password cracker I didn't want to see. "For journalism," she said, which was a way of saying it had gotten her into rooms she shouldn't have been and out of stories that saved her job. We didn't crack the flash drive that afternoon, although we did crack a bottle of sparkling water that tasted like pears. Rhea suggested I pull Graham's credit report, but the site locked me out and said the account had been frozen. We tried the other bureaus. One said the identity had multiple active addresses in 4 states. Another said the social security number was associated with 2 birth dates, 3 mobile accounts, and a company filing called Polar Apex Consulting LLC in Delaware. "If you hadn't mentioned it," Rhea said, "I'd say it was a shell." She looked proud that the word still fit in her mouth. At sunset, the house felt like an exhibit I remembered from childhood, a simulated storm in a dark room, lightning timed with a soundtrack, thunder sculpted by the subwoofer. The refrigerator hummed. The porch light clicked on at 7:12 because it didn't know to be afraid. The doorbell didn't ring, but my phone did, a number with no name. I answered because fear can be rehearsed only so many hours in a row. "Is this Caroline?" a voice asked, low and slow like it had learned to speak on the other side of glass. "Yes." 2 questions to hang up on. "Do you have the drive? Do you know the phrase?" "What phrase?" I said. And the voice laughed the way wind laughs when it blows through a hollow thing. "Then don't trust badges," it said, and hung up. I stood in the kitchen with my phone and the cat and the hum of the refrigerator and tried to swallow without water. After a while, I went back to the guest room and slept under our daughter's old dance trophies on the shelf. I could almost hear the applause she once danced to. I woke at 3 with a song in my head I couldn't place and a decision I didn't want. In the morning, I drove to the mailbox rental on Killingsworth, listed on the fake registration. The clerk wore a hoodie with a cartoon sun on it. When I asked for box 149 from Mr. Fuller, she didn't look up. She said, "We don't hand out boxes. You need a key." She moved a pile of small packages like building blocks. "You can leave a note." I wrote a note that said, "Call me," and then scratched that out. I wrote, "Stop this." I folded it small and slid it through the metal slot, and when it caught, I nearly cried. On my way back, I stopped at the credit union where we kept the most boring part of our savings. The manager, a man with a wooden tie clip that's shaped like a pine tree, told me I'd been removed as a joint owner 2 months ago. The words tumbled out of his mouth in the wrong order because there was no right order to say them. I stared at him as if he'd recited a recipe. "That's not legal without my consent," I said, like a plea and a lecture and a prayer. "I can't change it without a court order," he said, and handed me a brochure with a cartoon house on the front and a phone number where brave optimism went to die. Back home, the porch light was still on from the night before and made the middle of the day look like theater. The house smelled faintly of solder, a metallic scent I couldn't place until I found a small burn mark under the office desk where a cord had been plugged and unplugged enough times to bruise the paint. I took the flash drive to Ria's with the kind of breath people take before dives. She'd called a friend who did digital forensics for a living and for fun, and when he arrived with a laptop and a grin that implied he'd make the problem worse before he made it better, I was ready to welcome anything that had momentum. "Name's Malik," he said, and shook my hand with the confidence of someone who knows how stories come apart under light. "I'm going to assume this is your husband's and that he's alive unless you tell me otherwise. I'm also going to assume that your kitchen has better snacks than mine." We spread crackers and cheese on a cutting board like we were building an altar. Malik plugged the flash drive into a write blocker and then into his machine and watched lines of text scroll the way a doctor watches a monitor for a heartbeat. Your guy liked to pretend he was careful, but he also liked things to work, so he used a standard password manager that's either key to a passphrase you already tried or to a phrase he thought you'd never guess. "What phrase?" I said, and the words on my phone echoed. "Don't trust badges." "Do you know the phrase?" the caller had asked, like a catechism. Malik tried numbers, dates, palindrome versions of initials, and something he called keyboard walks. Nothing opened. We were 3 hours in when Rhea got up for more water and said, "You know what my ex used to do? He'd pick a phrase out of thin air because he thought he'd remember it and then forget it in the parking lot." She laughed. "He used to say the fog would clear by August because that's when our fights ended." Malik typed August fog, with and without the space and the capital letters. The flash drive accepted the phrase like a key in a hotel door, without sound or fuss. "August fog," Malik said, and looked at me as if I'd already known. I didn't know, but my skin knew. My skin felt hot and cold at once, like a fever admitting rain. Malik copied files to a secure drive and mapped folders into a tree that branched like a bad dream. There were spreadsheets with supplier codes and lot numbers and invoice trails. There were emails from addresses that ended in numbers instead of vowels. There were PDFs of federal procurement rules annotated in gray highlighter, with notes in a hand I recognized, the small angular print my husband used when he didn't want me to see his notes on grocery lists.
There were memos about Atlas North Dynamics and Aero Nova cross-billing, about shell vendors that supplied nothing more than paper, about cost-plus contracts whose math worked only if you believed in saints. And there was a ledger labeled Polar Apex, disbursements, listing payments into accounts that had no names beside them, only rivers, Willamette, Columbia, Snake. It looked like he had named accounts after water because water could not have edges, because water could hold a reflection without holding what it reflected. "What is this?" I asked, and the question was too big for the room. Procurement fraud, kickbacks, maybe a whistleblower built the file. He clicked on a folder named Family, and I flinched hard enough to knock my knee against the table. Inside were scans of a boy's birth certificate, a woman's driver's license, a school enrollment form, a health insurance card. None of the names were ours, and the dates were wrong enough to feel like jokes I didn't get. Maybe he was building an alternate shelf. And when he saw my face, he said softly, or he was taking evidence of a ring that made false identities to staff false companies. There were also videos saved with ugly file names. Malik clicked one open and stepped back so I could be the one who saw first. The video showed my husband, or the man I called my husband, standing near a dry dock with a gray sky behind him, talking to someone whose voice we couldn't hear because the wind took it. Graham's mouth made a shape I knew and didn't. He looked 10 pounds lighter and 5 years more awake. He pointed at a geared mechanism that looked like something that should live inside a plane and said, though we couldn't hear the words, "This is where it leaks. This is where it breaks. This is where you can't see what you're buying." On the second video, he sat in a motel room with the curtains drawn and said into the camera, "If you are watching this, either you are me with a worse haircut or you are Caroline, and I hope like hell it's you." He smiled the old smile with too many teeth showing, the one he used to have. "I'm going to try to do this other ways, but if those fail, I need you to know I didn't marry you under a lie. I married you under a name that I could bear. The rest of them I have to carry like dead weight." Rhea covered her mouth. Malik paused the video because we all needed it to stop and start on our terms. I leaned forward and pressed play again because I needed it to continue more than I needed it to be kind. "I stumbled into the ring," Graham said. "It's not one ring, it's a braid of rings that feed each other. Fake vendors, inflated invoices, ghost parts for real planes. Atlas North is not alone. Aero Nova is not innocent. It's all a closed loop. They pay themselves and call it market." He looked tired in a depth I didn't know. "I did the math, Caroline. And then I did what I do when the numbers are too ugly. I took them apart. Then I made a new set of numbers that could get me inside to set it on fire. I'm sorry. I know sorry is a cheap word, but it's the one I've got without you in the room." He reached for something off camera and held up a slip of paper. "If you talk to any badge and they don't say the phrase, you walk. The phrase is August Fog." He tapped the paper like a drumbeat and then folded it into something that looked like a bird with one wing. "I have to go. If I don't see you before the fog lifts, I'll meet you where the river meets the sea." He smiled again, and this time his mouth knew how to show its teeth without apology. I cried in a way I hadn't cried since my father died. No sound, just gravity. When I got myself back under a thin layer of control, I asked Malik to make me a copy and asked Rhea for a pen because I needed to write down every place in the videos where the window light shifted. If I wrote it, I could hold it. We sat until the room went gray and then black and then blue with the TV light from the living room where Rhea's husband watched a game with the sound blow. When Malik left, he pressed a small external drive into my hand like a talisman. "Airplane mode, unplug your smart devices," he said. "Also, sleep somewhere else." I didn't ask him if he meant for one night
or forever. I slept at a hotel near the river with the kind of carpet that eats evidence. I woke to my phone vibrating with an unknown number and an unknown number of messages. The first was a voicemail from Agent Marino asking me to please call her. The second was an unknown text, "Don't go to the storage unit." The third was a photo of my house from my back fence, zoomed in. I sat still long enough to feel my heart flip like a fish. Then I packed a bag and drove to the storage unit because I felt bad about myself, and this was the sort of decision that, at least, could be measured. Riverlight Storage sat between a body shop and a church, which felt unhelpful in different directions. The clerk was a college kid who asked me if I wanted a lock with personality or a lock with bite. I said I had a unit under the name Fuller, and he looked at me as if I'd asked for a key to a city he'd never visit. 2 forms of ID, he said. I handed him my driver's license and a credit card and hoped confidence carried weight. It always has. It did now. He muttered something about how his generation was doomed and led me to a corrugated door, the kind that looks like it would roll you up with it if it liked you enough. Inside the unit were 3 banker's boxes, a suitcase, and a folded hand truck. The first box held coils of wires and what looked like satellite phone parts. The second held hard drives wrapped in anti-static bags and labeled with months and nothing else. The third held paper, a printout of procurement spreadsheets, and an envelope with cash and 20s, and a folded paper labeled, "If Caroline opens this, I failed." I opened it because he'd already failed at too many other things.
The letter was 3 paragraphs long and felt like something he rehearsed. He said that his name wasn't our problem, his work was our problem. He said he had used the name Grant Fuller to place himself in a heat map of people who got called for things that ordinary people didn't. He said he had planned to take it to the Office of Inspector General at the Department of Defense, but the cheaper route was always the first one everyone tried: internal ethics hotlines, corporate ombuds people. He said they didn't bite, they blessed. He said if I had the letter in my hands, it meant I should find a woman named Maya Voss. He said to ask her to say August Fog. I put everything back in the box except the letter and the smallest hard drive. On the way out, I noticed a black sedan with a bumper as ordinary as a bar of soap. I noticed it because the driver looked away from me badly, like someone who forgot what it looks like to not look. I drove to the public library instead of home, which is the sort of decision that feels reasonable on its face and insane when you say it out loud. I used a public computer to search for OIG contacts and found a line of names that themselves looked like involving government would involve time. I put my head in my hands, then looked up because a woman in a camel coat had sat across from me and placed a book on the table like a marker. "Caroline," she said, and her voice made me think of someone who at once yelled at stadiums and now talked in hallways. "My name is Maya. I'm the one you're looking for. Say the phrase." "August Fog," I said, and I wanted to laugh and cry because this was exactly the kind of line I would make fun of in a movie, and here I was saying it in a library that smelled like paper and breath. "Okay," she said, "we need to move." We moved to a coffee shop and took a seat near the register where noise could cover what noise couldn't. Maya put a napkin over the tiny hard drive like she was christening a ship. "Here's what you need to know. Atlas North Dynamics and Aeronova created a braid. The braid is shell vendors, ghost parts, and falsified lab results. It's not new. It's never new. Your husband got inside the shell and somebody kicked it." "He told the ethics people," I said. "He said they patted him on the head." "They patted him on the head and then patted the water and a fin showed up," she said. "There's a senator's aide, no need for names yet, and 3 managers at Atlas who run their own pipeline. Your husband used one identity to build the pipeline. He used another to map it. At some point, he decided to bring it down. The question is whether he got to choose the timing.
Is he alive? I asked. We don't know, she said, and didn't look away. If he is, it's because he's good at hiding in plain sight. If he isn't, it's because he told the truth to the wrong ear. She nodded at the hard drive. We'll mirror that and send it two separate ways, oversight and press. It's safer if one entity thinks the other has it. I put my hand into my pocket to touch the letter because I needed to touch something that didn't hum. My phone buzzed and I flinched. It was a text from Nora. Weird. Mom, are you okay? Call me. And a second later, a missed call from an unknown number. I called Nora first. She had the voice of a person trying to be the person other people need. I saw on the news there was an accident on I-5 and thought about Dad driving to the airport. And then you didn't answer, and then there was a siren outside our building. She said in a breath, Are you okay? I'm okay, I said. Don't go anywhere alone. If anyone says FBI and tries to meet you, ask them for 2 words. I gave her the phrase as if it could protect her like sunblock. She said she would. She said she was coming to me. I said don't. I said I didn't know where I was sleeping. After we hung up, I felt stable for about as long as it takes for a coffee shop door to open. The door opened and closed like a heartbeat. At some point, a man came in with a delivery bag and looked at us for too long. Maya laughed at something I didn't say and wrote on a napkin, "Not safe." She stood up with her cup and said out loud, "You promised me a scone, Caroline." And we walked out the back. We cut through an alley that smelled like bread and garbage and came out on a street that looked like 2 p.m. on a weekday when everyone has somewhere else to be. If you get a call and they say they can make it all go away, that's when it gets sharp. Don't negotiate. There is no it, and it does not go away. I drove to the coast because it felt like an answer. The town on the map was called Gull's Reach, after all, and its main street had a shop that sold saltwater taffy and candles that smelled like forests no one had permission to walk in. I ate a donut because denial wants sugar. On the beach, I watched a woman run with her dog in a windbreaker the color of emergency, and I thought of my husband saying, "Where the river meets the sea." The Columbia did that, not here, but up the road, which meant any poetic person could have said the same thing and meant any of 100 places. I gathered the idea up like driftwood and carried it back to the car. Back in Portland, the ordinary shape of the ordinary neighborhood made me angry at its ordinariness. How dare the grass grow? How dare the neighbor's flag not be at half-mast for the dead marriage next door? In our living room, I found a book on the shelf I didn't recognize and opened it and a key fell out. It was taped to the inside cover with a piece of blue painter's tape, the way a person would tape a thing they might need to move quickly. The key had a tag from a bank I knew in my bones. My grandmother had kept her will there. Safety deposit box keys are a little miss, small, ordinary, more powerful than the person who holds them. I drove to the bank with my hands steady because I wanted something to break inside me that wouldn't. And the bank manager asked me whether the box was mine and whether my husband would be joining us and whether I had a court order, because he had to ask those questions. I told him a version of the truth that made him more useful to me than he had been to anyone all month. Inside the box, there was no cash or jewels or spectacular confession. There was a pendant with a hidden hinge. Inside the hinge, on a stamped oval that smelled like old silver, an SD card. There was also a postcard of the Oregon coast, river meeting sea, a black line on gray water. On the back, he had written, "If you are looking for me, look up first. People always look down." He signed it with an initial I couldn't decide belonged to a stranger. Back at Reyes, Malik plugged the SD card into his laptop and whistled low enough to sound like a threat. The card held a ledger of usernames and passwords, and one odd entry labeled employers. Under that, a list of names and birth dates. One of them was Caleb Barnes, born September 20th, 1976, died April 7th, 1988. A quick search pulled up a mention in a local newspaper, archived like all the bones. Caleb died in a bike accident near Boise. His obituary said he loved Legos and dogs and the color green, and that during his short life he made people laugh so hard milk came out their noses. I stared at the photo of the boy until my throat burned. He told me once his childhood was a map, I said. He didn't say of where. We drove to Boise the next morning because grief and curiosity share a highway. The woman who opened the door wore her hair in the same braid I'd seen in the obituary photo when it was still a yellow rope. She knew what we were there for before we said it. I wondered when you'd come, she said, and led us to a living room with a framed map of Idaho on a wall with tiny pins stuck into it. She had kept pinning it, the map of where her boy had never grown up. She took my son's number, she said, pouring coffee the way people pour offerings. I hope he did something good with it before he did whatever else he did. He started badly, I said, because lies would be an insult to the pins. He may be trying to end well. She showed me a photo from a church picnic with the line of foster kids in a row, thin boys with wary faces, a girl with the firefighter helmet she wouldn't take off. A boy I recognized stared at the camera with eyes that said he could take your wallet and your confession and leave you convinced you got the better end. He used to call himself a tide, in and out, in and out. On the drive back, the highway seemed more honest than it had on the way out. It made no promises but that it would go where it went. I thought about names and the people they belonged to, and the people who belonged to them by force. I thought about my own name and how I lost it when I took his, and hadn't thought of that loss as anything but a custom. I thought about our daughter's name and the way she had signed her first rent check with a flourish that said she decided to keep the one I gave her. I thought about calling Agent Moreno and telling her everything and what everything would mean inside a machine that chews facts and blunts teeth. I called Maya instead, and she told me that a hearing was brewing in Washington, the kind where oversight builds a scaffold and hangs truth on it. We'll give them the documents, she said, but testimony matters. It's oxygen. Can you do it? I'm a data analyst who left her job to manage a house because it felt like the right time to make soup. I don't know how to speak in rooms where the walls eat words. You speak fine, she said. You speak like a person who knows where the numbers go when they stop being numbers. In the days before the hearing, the house became a citadel. Malik set up a digital dead man switch in case something happened to any of us. Rhea baked muffins with blueberries, like a normal person living a normal life. And I cried over them because sweetness had turned into a foreign country on a map I used to know. Agent Moreno called twice more and I didn't answer. Once, late at night, someone rang the bell and left a white envelope on my porch, labeled Caroline. Inside, a $20 bill, 2 photographs of me walking out of the storage unit, and a single word: choose. We flew to D.C. on a flight so early it erased the idea of night. TSA pulled me aside because one of my devices flagged, and Maya stood with me while a young agent swabbed it and smiled as if she'd chosen a field in which swabbing things at dawn felt like rebellion. The agent asked what kind of camera it was. I told her it belonged to my husband and that he hadn't taught me what things were. She said she hoped my husband was worth the trouble. I told her I hoped so too. Hope felt like a coat that kept blowing open. The building for the hearing was bigger than it needed to be. It had ceilings that made people small and chairs that made people important. Maya's hair looked like it wanted to fight. My hands wanted to disappear. At the sign-in desk, a woman asked me for my name, and I said it, my maiden name, without thinking. It felt like taking a jacket off after a long car ride. When she handed me a badge, she said, "Don't get lost," and I thought, I already did. The hearing opened the way television makes them open. Statements about duty and stewardship and the American story. I waited in a room with carpet the color of spinach and water bottles likely paid for by a committee, and I imagined Gray Mem in the hallway outside a dentist's office on our first anniversary, telling the insurance clerk his name like a man trying out a new suit. When they called me in, I sat and stared at the microphone as if it were a living thing that would bite and leave a scar. They asked me to state my name, and I did. They asked me to say how I came to possess the documents, and I told it in the order my body remembered. There's a way to tell a story so it sticks to the listener, and there's a way to tell it so it slides right off. I tried to tell it the first way. I talked about calendars and registrations and cinnamon donuts and a flash drive with the phrase that opened it. Not the phrase itself, not yet. I used words like alleged, the way you use oven mitts to lift something hot. The committee members looked at me in alternating degrees of patience and hunger. When I finished the long first part, I looked at Maya out of the corner of my eye, and she looked at me in a way that said, "You make the choice now."
Before any agent asked me to tell this story, I said into the microphone that echoed my voice back to my own ears, a man called my phone and told me to trust no badge without a phrase. So here's mine, August Fog. I watched two people in the back stand a little straighter. I watched one man at the table go very still. They asked questions that sounded like statements. They asked whether I thought my husband had committed crimes. I said I thought he had done things that turned this into a bad multiple choice question. They asked whether I was aware of any money transferred to me illegally. I said my bank had removed me from my own accounts while telling me they couldn't tell me who told them to. Someone asked whether I understood the gravity of accusing public companies of fraud. I said I had spent 20 years telling numbers how to behave and that these numbers had refused. The audience laughed in a way that hurt. I named no senators. I didn't have to. Maya's people had filed the documents such that they'd be read into the record without my tongue having to be the knife. Afterward, in a hallway with marble that made my shoes feel loud, a man in a blue suit I'd never seen stepped close and murmured, "It's not safe. He wants to see you." He kept walking so that if anyone watched, they wouldn't place us in a frame together. I followed him down a corridor that turned into a corridor that turned into a stairwell that smelled like chalk. The basement had the hush of people who know they are not supposed to be in a basement. In a small room with a soda machine and a bulletin board from 2 years ago, a man stood up and turned toward me. For a second, my brain flipped the silhouette into my husband through force of want. Then the second shifted into the man who had once been a boy in the Boise photo, and then into the man in the video pointing at a geared mechanism, and then into the man who had left cinnamon donuts on a seat he never warmed. He had a beard now and different glasses, but it was him in the way your body knows before your mind signs off.
"Caroline," he said, and his voice cracked on the second syllable like a stair that creaks only when the house is empty. "You're alive," I said, and then because words have a way of running away when you need them, I said, "How dare you?" "I don't get to explain this to you in a way that makes you admire me," he said. "I'd settle for understanding." "I have understanding," I said. "It doesn't change weight." He told me he had gone into a form of protection that was not the thing people call witsack, but its cousin that dresses in plainer clothes. He told me he had been allowed to speak in documents, but not in rooms. He told me that the person who had been his handler had been replaced by someone who wanted him to hand over the files and the phrase. I didn't, he said, because the phrase was the only thing that made me feel like we could still be in the same sentence. "You took my name," I said, and then corrected myself. "You asked me to take yours." "We chose it," he said, and then winced because there are some sentences that once said stick to your tongue like dry bread. "I chose it," he said, "and I chose it less for what it was and more for what it wasn't.
Caroline, I grew up losing names like pennies. When I finally had one I could keep, I held it wrong. Are you here to ask for absolution or instructions? I asked, because absolution is off the table. I'm here to ask if you want the rest of the file, he said, and to tell you I put money aside to unspool what I borrowed. It's yours, your name on the wire, so you're not on paper attached to what I built. You wired my name money? That's not protection. That's an invitation to be indicted. I'm not good at some parts of this, he said, and then smiled at himself like someone who recognizes his own punchline. I'm good at maps. I'm bad at people I love. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small square wrapped in wax paper. I got you a donut, he said, and then put it back, because he understood enough to know gifts should match the century of the wrong. I testified. I said, I heard, he said. I stood in a room where no one saw me and clapped in a way that felt like breathing. I didn't tell him your name, I said. You never met my name, he said, and the line would have been poetic if it didn't hurt. I asked him where he would go. He said he would go to a town no one thinks of, where the library still stamps the due date on a card with a real stamp. I asked him whether he'd be safe. He said, safe is a word you paste over a cracked window. I told him Nora deserved a sentence. He said, she deserves the whole page. We didn't touch. We didn't say goodbye. He said, August fog. And I said, I know. And walked back up into a building where history gets stapled. On the flight home, I wrote my maiden name on a napkin until the napkin looked like a child had done it. I slept 2 hours and woke with the line, the man who forgot his name, in my head, and felt mean for thinking it, and then felt less mean for naming it out loud to myself. When we landed, Maya told me to expect arrests within days. She told me to prepare for the press to camp on my lawn. She told me not to read comments. She told me to take the cat to a friend's because cameramen do not care about claws. The news broke the way news breaks now, all at once and then in waves. Atlas North CFO resigned in a press release that read like a prom apology. Aranova announced a compliance realignment and cut 3 managers loose like weights. A junior senator from a state I had once driven through made a statement about how serious his office took allegations and then resigned as a matter of personal choice. The man who had given me a white envelope with the word choose disappeared from my neighborhood or learned to be less obvious to my eyes. Agent Moreno called a 3rd time and left a message that said, I think you did the right thing. That doesn't always feel good. In the weeks after, I washed the house of him. I took down the framed diplomas and packed them into boxes because all the Latin nouns had turned into weather reports. I pulled every book off every shelf and found one more key that opened nothing and a ticket stub for a ferry we never took together. I slept in the guest room where the dance trophies made a skyline. I applied for a job in data integrity at a nonprofit inside the government that calls itself independent and tries to be. They hired me because I spoke in complete sentences about things that break under pressure, and because I knew you don't fix systems by asking them to confess their sins. Nora came home one weekend and stood in the kitchen with her arms folded and told me she had changed her name on her lease to my maiden name, and if I didn't mind, she would keep it. I like that it came with a person attached, she said. I want to be that person. I wanted to tell her the person she wanted to be was already in the house, but the line sounded like a greeting card, and we were too busy living in a ledger that didn't have room for saccharin. I mailed a letter to the woman in Boise with a scholarship fund form I swear I didn't start as penance. I named the fund after her son because the name belonged to her and to the boy who should have grown up to become a radiologist who played piano. I told her it would fund bike helmets and coding camps because it made me laugh to imagine government money spent on something that made sense. She sent me a thank you note with 3 exclamation points and a photo of her holding a green balloon. Ria sold a house to a couple with matching haircuts and told me she had almost forgotten what the world felt like when it wasn't looking at her friends. Malik texted me photos of his cat wearing a tiny hat because the internet had made him worse. Maya took a vacation to a place with pineapples and drank something that pretended to be immoral and wasn't. Agent Moreno sent me a link to a new policy drafted as a result of what we did. And the policy read like a person trying to learn how to do better. I forwarded it to my old boss. He didn't reply. Months passed the way months pass when you are rebuilding. You measure them in small wins in the absence of sirens. The rain softened the sidewalks into a dark gray I found myself loving again. I decided not to sell the house yet. I bought a new sofa in a color named after a spice I'd never cooked with. I bought a plant and told myself I could keep it alive. I learned to like the taste of my own coffee. One Saturday, I drove to the coast because the river doesn't always meet the sea. But when it does, it's the right kind of insistence. I walked the sand with my shoes in my hand and thought about a boy with a pocket full of names and a man with a bag full of lies and a woman with a pocket full of drive letters. A gull cried at an angle that sounded like laughter. I turned my face to the wind. I thought of the postcard in the safety deposit box in the line about looking up first. I looked up. Clouds piled like furniture, the kind you move in the wrong order and K for with your back. When I got home, there was a postcard in the mail. No return address. A photograph of a library with a real date stamp on the wall. On the back, in a hand I could pick out of a lineup of ghosts, a single sentence. August fog. Lifted. No name. No city. A dot for a period so precise I knew he used a pen he didn't own. I placed the postcard on the mantle instead of the diplomas and stood back and didn't collapse, which felt like a kind of ceremony. People asked me if I would take him back if he came back, and I learned to say, that's not the question. The question was whether I had taken myself back. You cannot return something you never owned. I owned my name now. I owned my days. On the anniversary of the hearing, I stood in the company break room with a plastic cup of bad lemonade and watched a new hire put too much sugar into his coffee, the way young men do when trying to make something bitter kind. He asked me if I ever got nervous speaking in public. I told him yes, and that if he ever found himself needing to tell a room full of people a story they didn't want to hear, say the truest small thing and let it anchor everything else. He asked me what the truest small thing in my story had been. I told him, cinnamon donuts. He laughed and then stopped because he realized I wasn't kidding. Cinnamon, sugar, untouched. The ordinary detail that had broken the ordinary. That night, I made soup because some routines you keep for yourself. I watched steam curl like the handwriting on a note. I set a second bowl on the counter without thinking and then put it away. The cat rubbed against my ankle. I petted him and he closed his eyes as if he didn't care about my politics. I ate standing up because chairs felt like a commitment. I washed the bowl and left it in the rack to dry, water beads catching light. Before bed, I opened a box of old papers and found a brittle receipt from the day we changed my name at the DMV. On the line where they'd entered my signature, the clerk had printed my new last name and underlined it twice, like she wanted to make sure the world didn't smudge it. I tore the receipt gently along the fold and put the piece with the underlines in my wallet. It wasn't proof of anything a court would respect. It was proof to me. In sleep, I dreamed a corridor the length of a life.
Doors on one side with names, doors on the other with numbers. I walked until I saw my own door, the one with a small brass plate that said the name I'd kept all along. I knocked. From inside, a voice I recognized said, "Come in." I turned the handle and woke with my hand in the air.
In the morning, I made coffee and a list. I always make lists. It's a way to tell the future how to behave. The first item was call mom. The second item was buy a birthday card for Nora. The third was pick up cat litter. The fourth was choose me again. I checked it off while the coffee dripped. Outside, the flag next door hung still because the wind had decided to rest. Weeks later, at a bookstore with a dog that slept under the register and a cashier with a tattoo of a mountain range so detailed it made me want to hike, I met a man buying a paperback on algorithms and a hardback on poetry. He said he was a math teacher at a community college. He laughed like a person who isn't afraid to be wrong. He asked me to recommend a novel, and I handed him a story about a woman who builds a city out of patience and spite. We had coffee because it seemed like a way to keep talking. He didn't ask me my last name, and I didn't offer it. And it didn't bother me because we were at the beginning of a sentence, and names are punctuation. He asked what my job was, and I told him I counted things that didn't want to be counted. He asked if I enjoyed it, and I said enjoy isn't the word. It feels like sandblasting rust. He said he understood because sometimes you have to erase before you can write. We went for a walk along a street that didn't try to be anything but itself. Back in my car, I put my hands on the steering wheel and realized they were steady without effort. When I got home, the porch light came on at 7:12, right on time. One evening, months after the hearing turned into investigations, turned into stories with headlines that grew smaller as the world needed new ones, I received a call from a number that was either a coincidence or a memory. I answered because I had learned that choosing is healthier than hiding. His voice sounded older by a decade, though it had been less than 2 years. "I heard about the scholarship," he said. "You always did the thing I should have done." "You could still do the thing you should have done," I said. "I did my part," he said. "It wasn't enough and never is. I wanted you to know I have a name. It's not the one you gave me or the ones I stole." "You don't have to tell me," I said. "It's for me," he said. "I wanted to say it out loud to someone who once kept me from drowning. It's Owen. I was Owen for a while when I was 11, and that one felt like it might have stuck if anyone had been paying attention. I pay attention now." "Owen," I said, and didn't tell him he sounded like a person who wanted redemption and would settle for proof of existence. "If you see Nora," he said, and stopped because he knew he had no right to that sentence. "If you see her," he said, "tell her she was the best map I ever got." "She doesn't need maps," I said. "She builds them." He laughed softly, and the line carried the sound like a wire carries light. "I know," he said. "August fog." "It lifted," I said. After we hung up, I walked to the mantel and flipped the postcard over so that the image faced the room. The library looked like a place where anyone could walk in and become smarter than when they walked out. I imagined him there, Owen, passing time between duties by reading a book about birds. I imagined him buying cinnamon donuts he would let go stale because old habits die loud. I imagined him making a list with one item on it, "Stay gone." I stood in front of the mantel until my legs locked and then unlocked, and I didn't cry. That surprised me. It shouldn't have. There were only so many tears available for this. You burn them and then you burn clean. The last time I visited the coast that year, I rented a cabin that smelled like cedar and wet coats. I took a sketchbook because it felt like a thing a person might do at a coast in a story, and because I wanted to see if my hands could make something that wasn't a note. I drew the river because it knows how to go around obstacles without asking permission.
I drew the mouth where it widens and then lets go. I drew a goal that refused to stay still. I wrote my name in the corner in small letters because it mattered and because I wanted to keep it mine. On the drive back, the highway cut through a tunnel blasted out of rock. On the other side, the light widened in a way that made people speed up. I kept my speed steady. I counted mile markers because numbers have always been my comfort food. When I got home, my porch light clicked on at 7:12, and I stood under it a minute longer than necessary, like a person who wants to measure the shape of the radiance. A year later, the plant I bought was still alive. The scholarship had sent 3 kids to a summer program where they built robots that solved problems they had had as children. Nora's lease was up and she moved to a nicer apartment with less mold and more sunlight. She kept my maiden name and took a new one when she married a woman who made furniture by hand and swore at it affectionately. We danced at the wedding in a backyard strung with lights, and I tripped over my own feet, and the dog barked a toast.
On a Tuesday that could have been any Tuesday, I found a small cardboard box on my porch with no return address. Inside was a book of poems about rivers, a note that said, "For your collection," in the same neat handwriting I once found on grocery lists, and a library due date slip from a town I decided not to look up. I put the book on the shelf without ceremony. I made soup. I turned on the porch light at 7:12 because habit is an inheritance. And some things, when they work, you don't try to improve. People like to say that you can't outrun your past, but that's a measurable sentence with a measurable answer. You can't outrun it, but you can outlive it. You can stand in your kitchen and take a breath that doesn't taste like fear. You can choose your last name and then use it like a tool to open a door. You can forgive what doesn't deserve forgiveness and still refuse to open your hands. You can love a man who once forgot his name and still love yourself more. You can build a life that makes sense on paper and in daylight. You can teach yourself to listen for your own voice against others, even when their jackets have badges. At a community center where I sometimes volunteer now, there's a bulletin board where people post names of lost dogs and free mattresses and classes that start next month. I pinned a flyer there for a workshop on identity theft, and on the day of the class, 10 people showed up, each carrying their own stack of papers and their own stack of shame. I told them my name at the beginning. I told them that the worst part isn't the money. It's the part where you start doubting your own edges. We spent 2 hours calling numbers that kept us on hold and filling out forms that asked us to tell the same story 3 different ways to 3 different agencies. One man cried when we got his credit unlocked. A woman with a careful haircut said she could sleep that night. This is what redemption looks like when it's built with office supplies. On my way out, past the vending machine that only took quarters, a young man stopped me and asked if the class would run next month. I said yes. He said his uncle needed it, but was embarrassed to ask. I told him to have his uncle tell me his name and I would handle the rest. He smiled and said the name, and I wrote it down. And it was an ordinary name, like a fence post, and it felt like a small prayer answered by the person who said it out loud. Some nights I still wake with a shape in my head, like a man in a doorway with too many possibilities. On those nights, I walk to the window and look out at a street that has decided to be quiet for once. I think of gulls. I think of receipts. I think of the noise a flash drive makes when it doesn't make noise at all, but opens to a life you didn't know you were living in. I think of my grandmother's safety deposit box and the way the bank manager placed it on the table like a sacrament. I think of my name and say it in my head until it sounds normal again.
I do not know where he is. Not exactly. I suspect a town with a library that stamps cards and a diner where the waitress knows how he cakes his eggs and he tips in cash because habit dies last. I suspect he teaches a kid to fix a bicycle chain and names the grease thing after a constellation because he remembers a night when he learned the name of Orion from a foster father who lasted a month. I suspect none of this is true, and I am okay with suspicion. There are rooms where you learn to live without proofs. I know where I am. I am in a house that is mine, under a sky that is nobody's, breathing air that tastes like coffee, making lists I don't share with anyone. I am in a life where the porch light comes on at 7:12, and if I decide to change the timer, I can, and no one will make a note. I am a person who counts things that don't want to be counted and then names them until they are less dangerous. I am a woman who opens the door to herself when she knocks. The man who forgot his name is not my story. He is a chapter that proves the spine. The story is me standing in a hearing room with bad carpet, saying something that is true and small and heavy, and then walking out under a sky that doesn't care and still welcomes you. The story is a scholarship fund for a boy who loved the color green. The story is a daughter signing her name with an extra curve at the end. The story is a cat sitting on a printer that doesn't print anymore but hums like it's trying. The story is the taste of cinnamon and the fact that I will buy donuts when I want them and throw them away when I don't. If he ever knocks on my door, I will open it as far as safety allows and ask him for the phrase. If he says it, I will believe him long enough to hear the rest of his sentence and then decide whether it belongs in my house. If he doesn't say it, I will close the door and lock it and make soup and play the radio loud enough to drown out footsteps. The choice is mine, and there is nothing more American than that, except perhaps a porch light coming on at exactly the time you told it to. On a Sunday with thin sun, I drive to the river and stand on the bank where it is narrow enough to feel human and wide enough to hum in a register your bones understand. I throw a stone and it disappears what the gray stones have when they're doing what they're meant to do. The surface smooths itself and goes on. There is a sign that says no swimming and another that says be kind, carry out what you carry in. I carry out the stone that wasn't mine. I carry my name home. I unlock my door. The porch light clicks on at 7:12. I leave it. It is good to leave some things exactly as they are.